She saved a man with nothing, who secretly owned everything. In a world driven by what people appear to have, she was someone who looked deeper. She didn't measure a person's worth by their clothes, their car, or their status. She believed that every soul, no matter how scarred or silent, carried a story no one had heard. So when she saw a man sitting on a cold street bench, soaked from the rain, clutching nothing but a torn jacket and a tired gaze, she didn't see a stranger to avoid. She saw someone who needed help. And she stepped closer. He didn't ask for anything, no money, no attention, not even a conversation. His silence was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of arrogance or bitterness. It was the quiet of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and didn't know whether the world still had a place for him. She offered him tea, food, dry clothes, and a small space in her modest home where warmth still lived. She gave without expecting. She listened without judging. And most importantly, she offered dignity without asking for details. He watched her kindness with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. With every simple meal she cooked, with every question she didn't ask, and with every act of care she provided, he realized something rare: she treated him as a human being, not as a burden, not as a beggar, and not as a story to feel proud about later. He had met people with power, wealth, authority, and influence, but none with a heart unspoiled by selfishness. She didn't know who he was, or who he used to be. To her, he wasn't a millionaire, an investor, a CEO, or someone who quietly controlled the future of industries. He was just a man in pain. What she didn't know was that behind his silence lay a world she couldn't imagine. He wasn't poor. He wasn't broken financially. His wealth could buy buildings, businesses, and entire city blocks. But none of that mattered to him when he was at his lowest, emotionally shattered and invisible in the world he once ruled. On the outside, he looked like a man with nothing. In truth, he was a man who had everything except the one thing money could never buy: genuine care. She saved him, not with money, not with influence, and not with grand gestures. She saved him with humanity. And that was the one thing he could never purchase, no matter how rich he was. As he healed quietly under her roof, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: her kindness had changed his life long before she discovered who he really was. Some people give help because they can. She helped because she cared. And that is priceless, even to a man who owned everything. People often rush to help those who look valuable. They show kindness to those who shine, respect those who hold power, and admire those who appear successful. But true compassion isn't measured by appearances. It doesn't choose who deserves dignity. It gives because giving is a reflection of character, not reward. And she was a woman built entirely from that rare, quiet goodness. The night she met him, he wasn't the kind of man people would notice. His clothes had lost their shape, his hair was uncombed, and his eyes were tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from losing battles no one else knew existed. He sat alone outside a small convenience store, not begging, not asking for sympathy, just existing on the edge of the world as if he had nowhere left to belong. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that this man once stood in high boardrooms, commanding decisions that shaped industries. She didn't know he had a name recognized in wealthy circles, a name whispered with admiration by investors, a name printed on company papers and luxury headlines. She had no idea that the world he once lived in was built partly by his mind. All she saw was a broken man trying to disappear. While others passed him by, judging him by the dust on his shoes and the wear on his jacket, she paused. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she could not ignore someone who seemed forgotten by everyone else. She offered him food first, because hunger is one of the most painful things to hide. She offered him a simple conversation, because loneliness is heavier than hunger. And later, she offered him trust, a place to sleep under a roof that wasn't extravagant, but warm, safe, and genuine. He didn't speak much. His story remained a locked room. But she understood that some people speak through silence, and some wounds are too deep to describe. So she let him heal quietly. She asked nothing, demanded nothing, and expected nothing from him. She treated him not as someone broken, but as someone human. He watched her work long shifts, making barely enough to sustain herself. Yet she still shared what little she had. She wasn't wealthy in money, but wealthy in heart. And slowly, bit by bit, he began to remember what it felt like to be seen, not for status, not for power, but for the simple fact that he existed. The world knew him as a man who built empires. She met him as a man who had lost himself. And without knowing his past or his worth, she gave him back something his wealth could never purchase, the belief that life still held kindness. Someday, she would learn who he truly was. But the real story wasn't about his riches returning. It was about how her humanity saved the richest part of him, his soul. Some people give because they feel obligated. Some give because they want to be admired. But she gave because kindness was stitched into the core of who she was. She didn't treat people based on their income, their looks, or their social value. She treated everyone the same, with gentle respect, sincere consideration, and quiet warmth. And that is what made her different in a world where most hearts have price tags. The man she met seemed unremarkable at first glance. He had the face of someone who had seen too many losses, and the posture of a person who had forgotten how to stand tall. His clothes didn't tell a story of success, and his silence didn't suggest authority. If anything, he looked like someone who was simply trying to survive the day. She didn't know that the same hands he kept hidden inside torn sleeves once signed papers that moved billions across accounts. She didn't know that those tired eyes had once overseen boardrooms filled with people waiting for his approval, his vision, and his decisions. She didn't know that he stood at the top of a financial world most people only dreamed of, until everything collapsed around him. What she noticed instead were the small, quiet details, the way he flinched at loud voices, the way he hesitated before accepting help, the way he sat near corners as if trying to disappear. She saw pain, not failure. Struggle, not weakness. Humanity, not a burden. So she offered kindness in the simple ways that matter most, a warm meal instead of questions, a safe place to rest instead of judgment, respect instead of curiosity. She didn't pry or demand explanations. She didn't lecture or pity him. She let him exist without expectations. And sometimes, the ability to exist freely is the greatest gift one can offer another person. He accepted her kindness slowly, cautiously. Not because he didn't need it, but because he couldn't believe it was real. He had lived in a world where everything came with a condition, a price, a negotiation, or a hidden agenda. He had seen deals disguised as friendships, partnerships disguised as loyalty, and generosity disguised as strategy. But she wanted nothing from him, not money, not validation, not promises. To her, he was simply a man who needed warmth. To him, she was proof that goodness still existed without motives. He carried a world made of power, companies, investments, influence, but none of it held meaning anymore. She carried a world made of compassion, small gestures, quiet strength, genuine care, and that was the world that saved him long before she discovered who he really was. One day she would learn of the empire he once ruled, the wealth he could reclaim, and the influence he still possessed. But the truth of their story wouldn't be found in his riches or his identity. It would be found in the moment she chose kindness without knowing she was giving it to a man who could buy everything, except the sincerity she gave freely. We often assume power wears polished shoes, speaks confidently, and walks surrounded by attention. We believe wealth arrives in expensive cars, fitted suits, and branded signatures. But sometimes power hides behind exhaustion. Sometimes wealth wraps itself in silence. And sometimes the most influential people look nothing like what the world expects. That night, she didn't know she was helping someone who could have bought half the city if he wanted to. She only knew she couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. He was sitting near a closed pharmacy, leaning against the wall as though it was the last thing holding him together. His clothes were worn, his hair a mess, and the expression on his face was not just tired, it was empty, as if losing something so big had hollowed out everything inside him. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look demanding. He just looked lost. People passed him without a second glance. Some looked at him with discomfort, others with judgment. None stopped. None cared. Why would they? To them he looked like someone who had messed up his own life, someone whose problems were the result of bad decisions. People forget that even the powerful fall. Even the wealthy break. And even the strong collapse when the weight gets too heavy. She didn't see a caution. She saw a human being in pain. So she walked toward him instead of around him. She asked if he needed help. He didn't answer at first, almost stunned that someone spoke to him kindly. She offered water, a sandwich she had just bought for herself, and a moment of human decency he hadn't felt in weeks. It was such a simple gesture, yet it pierced through the walls he had built around his brokenness. She took him somewhere warm, a small local cafe, nothing fancy, nothing expensive. The city lights reflected through the window, illuminating them both as if the world was watching a secret unfold. She talked about normal things. She didn't once ask who he was, why he was there, or what he had lost. In a world full of questions and assumptions, she offered peace instead of curiosity. He held answers that could change the way people treated him. He could have told her about the businesses he owned, the buildings with his signatures hidden in their blueprints, the bank accounts with enough zeros to erase worry forever. He could have shown her the world he quietly controlled. But none of it mattered to him anymore. What good was power without peace? What value was wealth without meaning? And as she helped him stand, guiding him through a city full of his own investments, he realized something profound. This woman, who owned nothing compared to him, had given him more than money ever could. She gave him dignity. She gave him kindness without hesitation or expectation. She saw him, not what he could provide. Life has a way of disguising truth in the most unexpected forms. The most valuable people aren't always wrapped in luxury, the most loyal hearts don't come with grand introductions, and sometimes the richest soul you'll ever meet looks like someone with nothing left to offer. She didn't realize this when she met him. To her, he was just a quiet man with tired eyes and a rumpled jacket, someone life had clearly beaten down. But the richest man she would ever encounter was sitting right in front of her, disguised in simplicity she didn't question. From the very first moment she saw him, she didn't feel pity. She felt empathy. She sensed heaviness behind his silence, but she didn't assume weakness. She only knew that some kind of storm had washed through his life, leaving him alone in the aftermath. She offered support in the way only real kindness does, softly, without forcing gratitude, without making him feel indebted. She didn't give him help as if he were broken, she offered it as if every person deserved a chance to stand again. It would have surprised anyone to know who he really was. He was the kind of man whose name once moved markets, whose signature unlocked skyscrapers, whose decisions traveled across countries in seconds. His presence, when he stood at the top, had never required explanation. People recognized it without asking. They listened without hesitation. They followed without question. But power comes at a price, and success sometimes drains what it should nourish. Somewhere in the pursuit of building empires and controlling numbers bigger than most would earn in lifetimes, he lost his peace. He became wealthy in assets but bankrupt in meaning. He had everything except the will to continue holding it, until the world collapsed around him in a way no fortune could prevent. By the time she found him, none of that mattered. The world he once owned felt distant, irrelevant, and heavy to carry. And she didn't ask him for his story. She didn't try to fix his past. She only made sure he had a place to rest, food to eat, and someone to speak to if his silence ever became too loud. She didn't know how rare that was. He had met people who only saw his wealth, people who bowed to his influence, and people who pretended to care only to gain from his status. But she cared without knowing a single detail. She gave without calculating value. She respected him without thinking about what he could give back. The richest man she would ever meet turned out not to be defined by billions or by power, but by what he finally discovered through her, that true wealth isn't measured in money, it's found in the hearts that expect nothing yet are willing to give everything. And someday, when the truth of who he was finally came out, she would realize that she gave more than she ever received. She offered humanity to a man who had everything but love. And that made her richer than he had ever been. Most people offer help expecting something in return: recognition, gratitude, a favor, a promise. True compassion, however, asks for nothing. It is given without knowing whether the person receiving it will ever be able to repay it, or even remember it. That's who she was. The kind of person who didn't measure kindness like currency. She gave it freely, almost instinctively, as if refusing to help someone in need was unthinkable. So when she saw him, lonely, exhausted, and trying to hide the weight in his eyes, she didn't hesitate. He wasn't begging on the streets, nor trying to attract sympathy. He simply looked invisible, as though the world had forgotten he existed. She asked if he needed help. He said little, almost shocked someone noticed him. She didn't dig for answers or demand his story. Instead, she offered practical, uncomplicated kindness: food, a warm drink, a safe place to sit. He didn't know how to respond at first. In his world, help always came with conditions. Kindness was never free. People smiled because they wanted access to his power. They listened because they needed him to open doors. They pretended to care because his name meant opportunity. For years he had been surrounded by people who valued what he could give, not who he was. And when his world fell apart, they vanished faster than he imagined, leaving behind only silence and betrayal. But she wasn't like any of them. She didn't recognize his name. She didn't know his past. She didn't even suspect that the man she was helping once held enough influence to change the direction of entire companies, industries, and lives. She only saw someone struggling to survive and made that her concern. She shared her space, even though her life was modest. She split the groceries she could barely afford herself. She offered him care without ever asking what he would do for her in return. She didn't know that he held knowledge, resources, and connections that could transform her future in ways she couldn't dream of. She didn't know that the man she was keeping alive emotionally and quietly was capable of changing her fate with a single decision. To her, he was a stranger who needed help. To him, she became the only person who ever showed him friendship without a motive. She protected his dignity without understanding how rare that was. She treated him like a human being, not an opportunity. And in doing so, she gave him something his wealth could never buy: a reason to rebuild. She helped him survive at his lowest, never guessing that someday he might be the one to lift her higher than she ever imagined. Not as repayment, not as a favor, but because she earned a place in his heart through kindness that needed no reward. In a world where generosity is often measured by status, influence, or wealth, true kindness is rare. Many people give because they can, because they have resources, time, or authority. But giving without heart is hollow. It may feed the body or solve a problem temporarily, but it cannot heal what is broken inside. She was different. She gave because she genuinely cared, because the pain she saw in others touched her own soul. And that kind of giving is something no fortune can purchase. When she first encountered him, he appeared to be just another lost man, someone the world had discarded. His clothes were worn, his posture slumped, his eyes tired, and his presence quiet. He didn't ask for help. He didn't beg. He simply existed in a state of brokenness that no one else seemed to notice or care about. People passed by him every day, unaware of the weight he carried. Most would have assumed that if someone could change his circumstances, it would require money, influence, or connections. But she saw differently. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't question why he had fallen or what mistakes led him there. She didn't care about the label that society might place on him: rich, poor, successful, failed. She only saw a person who needed a hand to hold, a heart willing to listen, and someone who deserved to be treated with dignity. She offered small acts of kindness, a meal, a conversation, a warm smile. She gave without expecting repayment or recognition. She helped because she cared, and that was her only measure of value. What she didn't know was that he could own worlds. His wealth was unimaginable. He had the power to buy buildings, companies, even influence governments. Yet none of it mattered to him at that moment. What he needed was the human touch that money could never buy, the authenticity, warmth, and selflessness she offered freely. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, pierced through the walls he had built around himself and reminded him what it felt like to be seen, understood, and respected as a human being. To him, she was priceless. Not because she was wealthy or influential, but because she gave him something he had been searching for silently, genuine care. She had no idea how valuable her compassion was. And in doing so, she reminded him of a truth no fortune can provide: true connection, empathy, and human kindness are worth more than anything money can buy. Even to a man who owned everything, her heart held a richness that his millions could never match. She gave freely, without expectation, and in that giving, she transformed him, not with wealth or power, but with the most powerful force in the world: genuine care. Some people give because they can. She helped because she cared. And that, in the end, was more valuable than all the riches in the world.